On June 15, 1969, 14 men were eliminated across the streets of Biloxi, Mississippi, in less than 2 hours. The sweltering Mississippi heat hung heavy over the city, but it wasn't the weather that had everyone on edge. It was the sound of blood being spilled, of a feud that had reached its boiling point. The Thomas family, known for their tight grip on the local drug trade, had been pushed to the edge. Rival gangsters had taken something from them, a debt that wasn't just financial but a matter of family honor. Now, the debt was about to be repaid in the most violent way possible. With the town's streets running red, a message was sent. Crossing the Thomases wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence. In just a few short hours, 14 lives were erased, and the Thomas family cemented their place in Mississippi's brutal criminal history. But be warned, this is not a story for the faint of heart. If you have the courage to continue, leave a like and subscribe. But remember, this is based on real events, and the violence you're about to hear is chilling. The streets of Biloxi were quiet that Monday morning, the kind of quiet you only find in a town where everyone knows everyone else's business. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the aging buildings and coastal roads. It was an ordinary day, at least on the surface. But beneath the calm, tensions were building, and by midday, the city would be soaked in blood. At the heart of it all was the Thomas family, a name that carried weight in every corner of Mississippi. Their reputation stretched far beyond Biloxi. They were known for their iron grip on the local drug trade and their cold, calculating approach to business. The Thomases didn't make deals. They made demands, and when those demands weren't met, there was a price to pay. For years, the Thomas family had worked with a number of local and out-of-state dealers, providing them with whatever drugs they needed in exchange for loyalty and protection. But recently, things had started to go sour. The profit margins were shrinking, and competition in the drug game had grown fiercer. The family's control was starting to slip. The trouble began when a small-time gang known as the Jackson Crew began to encroach on the Thomases' territory. Led by a man named Jerry "Red" Jackson, they were nothing more than a collection of petty criminals with a knack for street-level dealing. They weren't anywhere near the Thomas family in terms of power or influence, but they didn't need to be. They were bold, hungry, and willing to take risks. And the one thing they had that the Thomases didn't was a relentless drive to push boundaries. For months, the Jackson Crew had been cutting into the Thomases' profits, taking business from their established roots, and expanding into new neighborhoods. What started as small conflict soon turned into a war. Jerry Jackson had begun to run his mouth, boasting about how he would eventually overthrow the Thomas family's empire. He thought they were too old, too slow, to keep up with the new wave of street deals. That was a fatal mistake. The Thomases didn't just lose business to Jackson, they lost face. That was something they could never allow. To the Thomases, losing face meant losing everything. Their family, their business, and their power would all be at risk if they allowed Jackson and his crew to continue their rise. But there was another issue simmering beneath the surface, a $250,000 drug debt owed to the Thomases by one of Jackson's closest associates, a man named Benny, the Butcher Burns. Benny had a reputation for violence and ruthlessness, and he was the muscle behind the Jackson Crew's operations. The Thomases had extended the credit to Benny, trusting him to pay up once his business deals went through. But as time passed, Benny had stopped answering their calls, and the debt remained unpaid. The family had sent numerous warnings, each one escalating in severity. First, they sent their enforcers to Benny's home to threaten him. Then they made it clear that his family would be at risk if he didn't settle the debt. But Benny had been arrogant. He thought he could outlast the Thomases. That arrogance, that refusal to acknowledge the Thomases' authority, would cost him, and his entire crew, dearly. The stage was set for an explosive confrontation. It would come later that day, when the sun was high and the heat unbearable. The Thomases had decided that enough was enough. They couldn't allow Jackson and his crew to continue operating unchecked, and they couldn't let Benny get away with the debt. By mid-afternoon, the first of the Jackson Crew's men began to fall. The heat in Mississippi was relentless that early afternoon, the kind of heat that made the pavement melt and the humidity thick in the air. The streets of Biloxi were still calm, but tension was spreading like wildfire. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but everyone felt that something big was coming. The conflict with the Jackson crew was no longer just about business, it was personal. The Thomas family had a code of honor that went beyond profit. They had been challenged, and that was an offense that could not go unpunished. Jerry Red Jackson and his men had crossed an invisible line, messing with the family, their reputation, their legacy. Now there was no turning back. The Thomas brothers, Charlie, Vincent, and Tommy, were ready. They had grown up in crime, trained on the tough streets of Biloxi, learning that power didn't just come from money, but from fear. And to establish fear, you had to act with precision and brutality. The target was clear: Benny, the butcher Burns, and his associates. Benny was Jerry Jackson's right-hand man, the muscle behind the Jackson crew's operations, and because of that, he was seen as the cornerstone of the entire operation. Without him, Jackson's empire would lose its foundation, and the Thomases were prepared to destroy it. At 2 p.m., Vincent was already behind the wheel of the family's black Cadillac, a vintage car that passed unnoticed on those streets, but carried a menacing presence. He looked into the rearview mirror and gave a subtle smile. "Today is their end," he murmured. Charlie sat in the passenger seat, his expression impassive. He was always calm, always calculating the next move. "Let's go straight to the point. No more games," he said, reaching under the seat to grab his gun. Tommy, the most impulsive of the three, looked out the window, his hand nervously tightening around his weapon. He wasn't the type to plan. For him, action spoke louder. "I just want this over with," he said in a cold, emotionless voice. When the car stopped in front of Benny's old warehouse, the three brothers knew what was about to unfold. It was an isolated location, guarded by a handful of Benny's loyal men. But what they didn't know was that the Thomases had prepared for this situation with impeccable efficiency. They didn't just know where Benny would be, they knew how he thought, how he acted. The first move was silent. Vincent, Charlie, and Tommy moved through the shadows, quickly reaching their strategic positions around the warehouse. The operation to subdue and eliminate was about to begin. The guards watching the premises were the first to fall. A series of muffled shots echoed through the air, and before any of them had a chance to react, they were on the ground, immobilized. The Thomases, as always, made no prisoners. Benny was inside the warehouse with a group of his men, preparing a shipment of drugs that was destined for one of the largest distribution points in the northern part of the state. He thought he was safe, that the empire he and Jackson had built was untouchable. He was wrong. Charlie entered first, his harsh gaze fixed on Benny, who was distracted, handling a stockpile of cocaine packages. "Benny," Charlie said in a calm voice, yet with a threat hanging in the air, "you've got a debt to settle." Benny looked up, surprised to see the three brothers there. "You're playing with fire," he said, trying to maintain his posture of authority. But deep down, he knew he was in trouble. The arrogance he had displayed over the past months now seemed foolish in the face of the force he was about to confront. Tommy, who had no patience for this type of conversation, moved forward swiftly, grabbing Benny by the neck and slamming him against the wall. "Cut the talk, Benny. Your debt means nothing now. You've challenged the wrong people," Tommy said. Vincent, keeping his distance, observed the scene with the cold demeanor that always defined him. He knew Benny's death wasn't the end of the story. The price of this vengeance would be much higher. "This is just the beginning," Vincent muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Benny struggled, but Tommy's grip was unbreakable. "Why are you doing this?" Benny asked, his voice filled with anger and fear. "Just because of a debt? You're going to kill all of us?" Charlie stepped closer, his expression unchanging. "It's not about the debt, Benny. It's about respect. And you lost ours." With a swift, precise movement, Tommy drew the knife from his belt and drove it into Benny's stomach. The man fell, blood beginning to spread across the concrete floor as the brothers watched, unmoved. The mission was complete, but the message was clear. No one would mess with the Thomas family. As they left the warehouse, they knew this was just the first step in a larger war. The Jackson crew had become a mortal enemy, and the Thomases weren't feeling threatened. The war had begun and only one group would emerge victorious. But the Thomas brothers had no doubts about who would control the streets of Biloxi. The streets of Biloxi had never been quiet for long, but as the days dragged on after Benny's brutal elimination, the air seemed thick with anticipation. The Thomases had sent a message, loud and clear, but their enemies weren't backing down. The Jackson crew, now led only by Jerry "Red" Jackson and his remaining men, were fueled by rage and humiliation. And as the sun set over the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the tension in the air was palpable. For Jerry Jackson, the loss of Benny was more than just the death of a trusted associate. It was a personal blow. Benny wasn't just muscle. He had been Jerry's closest friend, the one man Jerry trusted in his criminal empire. Losing Benny meant losing a significant part of his strength and his ability to control the streets. And for Jackson, revenge wasn't just about making money. It was about proving he could still rise from this fall. He had to strike back. Jackson knew he was outnumbered and outgunned by the Thomases, but he had his own advantages. Unlike the Thomases, who had built their empire on intimidation and violence, Jackson had learned to use unpredictability as his weapon. The Thomases were used to following a script, dealing with enemies in a certain way. Jerry Jackson didn't play by the rules, and that was exactly why he was still alive. In the heart of Biloxi, Jackson's remaining men gathered in the shadows of an old dive bar, a place where no one asked questions and the patrons minded their own business. Jackson sat at a table, his eyes dark and calculating. He had been waiting for this moment for days, biding his time, making plans, and now it was time to act. "Do we go straight to the Thomases?" one of Jackson's men asked, nervously twisting his cigarette in his hand. "We got the numbers, we got the firepower, we can hit them where it hurts." Jerry looked up, his expression grim but resolute. "No. We don't hit them directly, not yet. They're expecting that. We're going to send a message that they never saw coming." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, his eyes burning with anger. "We're going to hit their people, their operations. They think they own this town, but they're just like every other gang, dependent on their business, their men, their suppliers. We'll take everything from them." As Jerry laid out his plan, a sense of unease began to settle over his men. What Jerry was suggesting wasn't just an attack on the Thomases. It was a war of attrition, a battle for control of the entire drug trade in Biloxi. Jackson wasn't looking for a quick win. He was looking for a slow, painful grind that would force the Thomases to respond, to overstep, to make mistakes. At that moment, as the plan took shape, one of Jackson's men, a younger recruit named Kevin, nervously raised his hand. "What about the family? The Thomases? They're not going to stop just because we hit their operations." Jackson's lips curled into a cold, merciless smile. "They won't stop, but they'll think twice. And when they do, we'll be ready. Trust me, Kevin, we'll make them come to us." Later that night, the Jackson crew set their plan into motion. They weren't after just any drug shipment. They were targeting the heart of the Thomases' distribution network. They knew the Thomases had several operations running in Biloxi, each one a lifeline for their empire. And Jackson had learned over the years that to hurt the Thomases, you had to hit them where it counted. As they made their move, they hit 3 different locations in quick succession. The first was a warehouse near the docks where the Thomases stored their drugs before distributing them. Jerry and his men, armed with automatic weapons, burst in, overwhelming the guards with military precision. The Thomases' men never stood a chance. The warehouse was looted, and within minutes, everything of value had been taken. But they weren't done yet. Next, they targeted a shipment that was en route from Louisiana, the Thomases' main supplier. Jackson's men ambushed the convoy just outside the city, seizing the drugs and eliminating 2 of the Thomases' drivers. The message was being sent, loud and clear. Jerry Jackson wasn't afraid to fight back, and he wasn't afraid to kill. By the time the Thomases received word of the attacks, it was already too late. The damage had been done, Jerry Jackson had hit them where it hurt most. Their operations were in disarray, their supply lines cut off. And while the Thomases were distracted, Jerry and his men slipped away, leaving no trace behind. Back at the Thomas family's compound, the brothers gathered to discuss their next move. The air was thick with anger, but also with a sense of urgency. They knew the Jackson crew wouldn't stop with just those attacks. They were going to retaliate, and it was only a matter of time before the Thomases were forced to respond. "Jackson's making his move," Vincent said, the cold calculation evident in his voice. "But he's underestimated us. He thinks he can break us by hitting our operations. He doesn't realize we've got more than just drugs." Charlie nodded, his expression grim. "We've been here before. He's a small-time player trying to play in the big leagues. But he's got a taste for blood now, and that makes him dangerous." Tommy stood, pacing back and forth. His hands were clenched into fists, the rage in his eyes unmistakable. "We let him hit us once. We won't let him do it again. This ends now." As the brothers began to strategize their counterattack, they all knew one thing. This was no longer a fight over territory, no longer a business dispute. It had become personal. And when the Thomas family fought back, it was always with the full force of everything they had. The streets of Biloxi were about to be soaked in blood once again. The days after Jerry Jackson's bold attacks on the Thomas family's operations seemed to stretch on forever. The Thomases, still reeling from the losses of both goods and men, had no choice but to regroup and retaliate with the full force of their influence. But Jerry Jackson's calculated risk had worked. He had disrupted their empire, caused chaos, and forced the Thomases to shift their focus from maintaining control to saving face. As the Jackson crew licked its wounds and celebrated its successes, Jerry Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before the Thomases came for him. But Jackson wasn't worried. He had prepared for this. His revenge had set the stage for a war, and now that the Thomases were on the defensive, Jackson had the advantage. He had been waiting for this moment for years. Jackson's confidence was shared by his men. Even though they had taken heavy losses, the thrill of seeing the Thomases shaken gave them a sense of invincibility. Jerry had promised them a new era, one where they could take control of the streets. They believed in him. They were ready for what came next. The Thomases, however, were a different breed. The family had always understood that their power wasn't just in numbers or weapons. It was in their ability to instill fear. And the fear wasn't just directed at their enemies. It was a fear that rippled through their own ranks, ensuring that everyone knew their place. The Thomases weren't just fighting for power. They were fighting to preserve their legacy. And a legacy was something you didn't let go of easily. Vincent Thomas, the eldest of the Thomas brothers, called the family together. The mood was somber. Their operations had been damaged, but their pride had been wounded even more deeply. "We're going to hit them hard," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're not going to give them the satisfaction of thinking they've won. Jerry Jackson crossed a line, and now we're going to show him what happens when you mess with the Thomas family." Charlie, always the more pragmatic of the three brothers, nodded in agreement. "We can't just go after him head on, though. That's exactly what he's expecting. We need to hit him where it hurts the most, his people, his supply routes, his money. We're going to bleed him dry." Tommy's fists clenched as he leaned in, his eyes blazing with anger. "We'll make him regret ever thinking he could take us down. No more games. It's time to remind him who runs this town." For the next few days, the Thomases operated in the shadows, preparing for their response. They used their network of informants and trusted allies to track Jerry Jackson's every move, learning his weaknesses and identifying the best way to strike back. Jackson's men were still scattered, rebuilding and rearming after their last attack. They weren't expecting another full-on assault from the Thomases so soon. The first step in the Thomases' plan was to hit Jackson's suppliers, cutting off his access to drugs and weapons. Jerry had built his empire on his relationship with a group of suppliers based in New Orleans, a partnership that had been lucrative for both sides. The Thomases had long known about this connection, and now it was time to sever it. Late one evening, a convoy of trucks carrying Jackson's supplies made its way along the highway to Biloxi. The Thomases, waiting in the shadows, ambushed the convoy with precision. The attack was quick and brutal. 2 of Jackson's men were killed on the spot, and the rest were captured. The trucks loaded with drugs were seized and sent to a secret location, out of Jackson's reach. Jackson, unaware of the attack until it was too late, knew this was just the beginning. The Thomases were playing a dangerous game, one they hadn't played in years, and Jerry wasn't going to make the same mistake Benny Burns had. He knew he had to hit back immediately, or the Thomases would continue to pick him apart piece by piece. The next day, as news of the ambush spread like wildfire, Jerry gathered his remaining men at an old warehouse on the outskirts of Biloxi. "They're making their move," Jerry said, pacing back and forth. "We knew they'd come for us. But now they've made a grave mistake. We're going to hit them where they least expect it, right in the heart of their family. No more playing nice. It's war." Jerry's men, now more focused and determined than ever, nodded in agreement. They knew the stakes were high, and they knew that the next few days would be crucial in deciding who would dominate the streets of Biloxi. It was do or die, and Jerry wasn't ready to die just yet. While Jerry made plans to take the fight directly to the Thomases, Vincent Thomas had a different idea. The attack on their supply chain was significant, but it wasn't enough. The Thomases needed to make a statement that would reverberate through the underworld, and that statement had to come from the top, the Thomas family itself. Vincent, Charlie, and Tommy gathered their enforcers for one final push. "We're going to hit them where it really hurts," Vincent said, his voice steady with conviction. "We're going after Jerry Jackson directly, but we're not going to leave anything to chance. We're going to make sure the message is clear. This ends with them, not us." The Thomases had learned from their previous encounters with Jerry. They weren't going to give him the chance to strike first. They would control the pace of the war, and when the time came, Jerry would pay the price for everything he had done. As the day turned to night, both sides prepared for the inevitable showdown that would bring the bloodshed to its peak. The stakes had never been higher, and no one could predict what would happen next. Would the Thomases reclaim their empire, or would Jerry Jackson and his crew finally topple the once feared family? Only time would tell. But the bloodshed was far from over. The night was thick with tension. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the streets of Biloxi. It was the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air knew that something inevitable was about to happen. The Thomases had struck hard and fast, but Jerry Jackson wasn't one to back down easily. He'd made it clear that he wasn't afraid of war. But as the city slept, one thing was certain: someone was about to die. Jerry Jackson, ever the strategist, had a plan of his own. After the Thomases' ambush on his supply convoy, he knew they were coming for him. He'd underestimated their resolve, and now he was going to make sure they paid for it. He was no longer the cocky, small-time dealer who had taken risks for the thrill. Now he was a man who had to protect everything he had fought for. His men had gathered in a safe house on the outskirts of Biloxi, a place that had once been a quiet haven for business deals and clandestine meetings. But now, it was a war room. Maps were sprawled across the table, and the faces of Jerry's men were grim. They all knew what was coming. "We need to hit them hard before they have a chance to regroup," Jerry said, his voice cold and calculated. "But we're not going to attack their turf. We're going straight for the Thomases' heart, the family. We hit them where it really hurts." One of Jerry's men, a quiet but lethal enforcer named Frank, spoke up. "What about their enforcers? They'll be expecting us." Jerry's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly why we're going in fast. We're going to hit them when they think they're safe, when they're out in the open. We strike hard and we don't leave anyone alive." As the plan took shape, Jerry's crew prepared for what was going to be the bloodiest night Biloxi had ever seen. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew they might not all make it out alive. But they were ready. The adrenaline was pumping, and the promise of vengeance burned in their veins. This wasn't just a street fight anymore. This was war. Back at the Thomas family compound, Vincent, Charlie, and Tommy were preparing for the next phase of their retaliation. They had anticipated that Jerry would come for them, and they were ready. But what they hadn't expected was how quickly things were escalating. Vincent sat at the head of the table, his hands steepled in front of him. We knew this was coming. We're not going to be caught off guard. The Jackson crew thinks they're going to push us into a corner, but they don't know us. They don't know what we're capable of. Charlie, ever the pragmatist, looked over the maps laid before them. We can't keep reacting. We need to take the fight to them. We need to send a message that this ends here. Tommy, his temper always close to the surface, slammed his fist on the table. I'm ready to go after them tonight. I'll take the fight straight to Jerry. Vincent looked at Tommy, his eyes hardening. No, we don't just go in blind. We need to be strategic. If we make the wrong move, we could lose everything. This ends when we say it ends. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew what was at stake. The Thomas family had built its empire on fear, and it was time to remind Biloxi why they were the most powerful name in the city. But the Jackson crew, with Jerry Jackson at the helm, was proving to be more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. By nightfall, both sides were ready. Jerry Jackson had set his plan into motion, and the Thomases were preparing to defend their legacy. The streets of Biloxi were about to be bathed in more blood. The first shots were fired at midnight. The ambush came without warning, as Jackson's men stormed into the Thomas family's neighborhood. They hit fast and hard, taking out a few of the Thomases' guards before the alarm even had a chance to sound. The streets erupted in chaos, and within minutes Biloxi was awash in gunfire. The Thomases weren't unprepared, but the sheer audacity of the attack caught them off guard. Vincent Thomas, ever the leader, was the first to respond. He rallied his men and moved quickly to the front lines. "Get inside, protect the family, now!" he shouted. Charlie and Tommy followed him, each ready to exact their own brand of vengeance. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, reverberating off the buildings. In the distance, you could hear the wailing of sirens, but it was clear. The police wouldn't make it in time. This was a battle between two rival families, and the only thing that mattered now was survival. As the fight raged on, both sides took casualties. Jerry Jackson had calculated his attack with precision, but he hadn't counted on the Thomases' tenacity. They fought back with the ferocity of men defending their homes. Each bullet fired, each life lost, was a testament to the high stakes of this brutal war. Inside the Thomas compound, Tommy and Charlie were on the front lines exchanging fire with Jackson's men. Tommy was consumed by rage, his movements quick and deadly. Charlie was more measured, his shots precise as he picked off the attackers one by one. They were a force to be reckoned with, but even they knew they couldn't hold out forever. The Jackson crew was relentless. At the heart of the battle was Vincent, who had positioned himself at a vantage point, watching as his men fought to hold the compound. He knew that the only way to win this war was to take down Jerry Jackson once and for all. But he also knew that in order to do that, he had to keep his family alive. The clock was ticking. Every second that passed brought them closer to either victory or destruction. The streets of Biloxi would never be the same again, and as the night wore on, the battle for control of the city intensified, with bloodshed paving the way for a deadly conclusion. Would the Thomases reclaim their empire, or would the Jackson crew rise victorious? The answer would come in the next few hours, but at what cost? The early hours of the morning were marked by an eerie silence that hung over Biloxi. The chaos of the night had died down, but it left behind a city scarred, streets littered with debris, and bodies that had once been men now lying cold in the streets. The smoke from gunfire still lingered in the air, and the sound of distant sirens seemed muffled, as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come next. Inside the Thomas compound, Vincent, Tommy, and Charlie gathered their remaining men. The battle had taken its toll on both sides, but the Thomases had held their ground. The Jackson crew had retreated, but they weren't done yet. Jerry Jackson's men were regrouping, and soon enough, they'd come back with a vengeance. Vincent, bloodied but resolute, stood in front of his family. His voice was calm but firm. "We've lost good men tonight, but we're still standing. Jerry Jackson wanted to test us. He thought he could take us down, but he underestimated who we are." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "Now it's time to end this. We finish this once and for all." Tommy, still seething with anger from the ambush, couldn't hide his bloodlust. "We should go after them now, hit them before they have a chance to regroup." Charlie, ever the strategist, disagreed. "No, we wait. Let them come to us. The longer we wait, the more they'll think they have the advantage. They'll slip up, and when they do, we'll be ready." Vincent nodded. "Charlie's right. We'll play this smart. We've been in control from the start. We're not about to lose it now." But as dawn broke and the first light of day illuminated the streets of Biloxi, the Jackson crew was preparing for one final assault. Jerry Jackson, despite the brutal losses, was determined to finish what he started. His reputation was on the line, and he knew that if he didn't wipe out the Thomases, his gang would crumble. He couldn't afford to lose this war. Jerry gathered his men in the same safe house where they had planned the previous attack. His face was drawn, bloodshot eyes betraying the exhaustion from the fight, but his resolve was ironclad. "We're going back in. This time we don't stop until the Thomases are finished." One of his men, Frank, who had proven to be a key enforcer, looked at him and said, "We lost a lot last night. Are we sure this is the right move? The Thomases are stronger than we thought." Jerry's gaze was cold, his voice steady. "We finish them today, or we die trying. There's no other option." At that moment, Jerry made a crucial decision. He would no longer just rely on his men. He would take matters into his own hands. By mid-morning, the Jackson crew was on the move. They knew where the Thomases were holed up, and they had one objective in mind: to wipe them out completely. Jerry wasn't just attacking a family, he was attacking an empire, and that empire had already cost him too much. But the Thomases weren't blind to the danger. As soon as they got wind of the Jackson crew's movements, they went into full defense mode. It was no longer about territory or money, it was about survival. Vincent and his family prepared for the final confrontation. "This ends today. We take out Jerry Jackson and we show every last one of his men what happens when you try to take what's ours," Vincent said with cold certainty. The streets of Biloxi would soon witness the final clash between the two families. As Jerry and his crew made their way toward the Thomas compound, the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. They knew this would be their last stand. There would be no retreat this time. No second chances. Both sides were ready. The Jackson crew was determined to prove that they could take down the Thomases, while the Thomas family was prepared to make a bloody statement. No one would ever challenge them again. The final showdown came without warning. As Jerry's men approached the compound, a hail of gunfire erupted from the Thomases' position. The battle had reached its fever pitch, and the streets of Biloxi became a battleground once again. The gunfire was deafening, ricocheting off the buildings as both sides exchanged fire. Frank, the enforcer from the Jackson crew, fell first, a bullet lodging in his chest as he tried to advance. The Thomases were ruthless, their precision deadly, but Jerry wasn't giving up. He pushed forward, dodging bullets, his mind laser-focused on his target, Vincent Thomas. Jerry knew that if he could take out Vincent, the rest of the Thomases would fall. As the two men locked eyes, everything else seemed to fade away. The noise of the battle, the bloodshed, the screams, it all blurred into the background. For a moment, it was just Jerry and Vincent. With a steady hand, Jerry raised his gun. But before he could take the shot, Vincent was already moving. He had anticipated this moment. With lightning speed, Vincent fired first. Jerry's body jerked back, the bullet tearing into his side. He staggered, his hand falling from his gun, and with a final, desperate lurch, he collapsed to the ground. The battle was over, but the aftermath would leave Biloxi forever changed. The Thomas family had won, but the price was steep. The streets were littered with the bodies of both their enemies and their own men. The bloodshed had been brutal, the consequences far-reaching. As Vincent stood over Jerry's body, breathing heavily, he looked around at the wreckage. The war was won, but the family had lost so much. Their empire had been preserved, but at what cost? The Thomas family would never be the same. The city of Biloxi would never be the same. And the legacy of the Thomas family's power would be etched in the blood-stained streets for years to come. The days that followed the final confrontation between the Thomas family and the Jackson crew were marked by an uneasy silence that fell over Biloxi. The once thriving drug empire of the Thomases had been left in tatters, the family's power now scarred by the bloodshed. The city, too, was forever altered. The streets, which had been the backdrop for so much violence, seemed emptier, quieter. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. No one in Biloxi would ever forget what had transpired in the days that followed. Vincent Thomas, having secured his family's survival, now faced the hard task of picking up the pieces. His men had been lost, their bodies scattered across the city. Some had fallen in the gunfire, others had succumbed to their injuries in the hours that followed the battle. Even those who survived would never be the same. The psychological toll of what had occurred would stay with them forever. In the days after the battle, the Thomases went underground, knowing full well that their actions had made them enemies not just of the Jackson crew, but of every rival gang and dealer in the region. While their reputation as a ruthless family had kept them at the top for years, the sheer brutality of the recent conflict left a shadow over their empire. The Jackson crew was gone, but the violence had created a vacuum, and now the other players in the game were circling, waiting for their opportunity to strike. But Vincent wasn't one to wait. He wasn't a man who rested on his laurels. Even as the weight of his losses pressed on him, he was already planning for the next move. If he had learned anything from the bloody war that had just ended, it was that survival in this business meant staying ahead of everyone else, outthinking and outmaneuvering those who thought they could take his throne. "These streets are ours," Vincent muttered to his brother Tommy one morning, standing over the city. The sight of Biloxi stretched out before him. "But there's a new kind of enemy out there now. They're watching, waiting. They think we're weak." Tommy, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "They're wrong, Vincent. We're not weak, but we're also not invincible. We've taken a lot of hits. We need to rebuild fast." Vincent turned to him, his face set in stone. "We will rebuild, but we'll do it on our terms. No one challenges us again. Not like that. The next time someone thinks they can take what's ours, they'll find out the true cost of going up against the Thomases." For weeks after the battle, the Thomases remained hidden from the public eye. They made strategic moves, reorganizing their operations and ensuring that the power they held was solidified. They knew that now, more than ever, they needed loyalty. The drug trade was still thriving, but the enemies were many and trust was in short supply. The family's internal structure was reshaped, with Vincent and Tommy taking the lead, while Charlie, their most trusted advisor, acted as the strategic mind behind the operation. However, the harsh reality of the situation was that their empire would never be the same. The loss of so many of their own men, their closest enforcers, weighed heavily on them. Even as they rebuilt, there were gaps in the network, cracks in the foundation that would take time to fix. As the weeks turned into months, the Thomases began to reassert their control over Biloxi. They reestablished their ties with old allies, making deals with smaller street gangs and regional dealers to shore up their supply lines. But Vincent knew that the city would never be what it once was. He had won the war, but the cost had been high. And as the blood of the Jackson crew dried in the streets, a new chapter of violence loomed on the horizon. It was an unusually hot summer when Vincent Thomas stood on the balcony of his newly reinforced compound, looking out over Biloxi. The once vibrant city had become a battleground, and now it was a place of careful rebuilding. But Vincent knew that no matter how much he tried to restore the old power, things would never be the same. The city had been scarred by too much bloodshed. He could hear the sounds of construction in the distance. New businesses under the Thomas family's control were starting to open again, a sign that the family was regaining its influence. But despite the outward signs of recovery, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that things were precarious. The quiet had returned, but only for a time. "We've got to stay ahead of them," Charlie said, breaking into Vincent's thoughts. "We can't let the city forget what happened, but we can't just rest on our past victories either. There are still new players trying to muscle in, and we need to make sure they know where the real power lies." Vincent nodded, his face hardened. "I know, and they will learn. But we'll need to be smarter this time. The game's changed. It's not just about brute force anymore. It's about control, about making sure every move we make is calculated." Charlie smiled. "That's the Vincent I know." The Thomases had endured. They had fought, bled, and conquered. They had lost family, friends, and power, but in the end, they had emerged victorious. The city of Biloxi would always remember the war that had consumed it, but the Thomas family would stand, scarred but unbroken. Yet even in victory, there were always new challenges. As the Thomases moved forward, they knew the cycle of violence wasn't over. Their enemies were out there, waiting, and in a world as unforgiving as theirs, peace was only temporary. But one thing was certain. As long as the Thomases stood, no one would ever forget the cost of trying to challenge them. Their empire may have been shaken, but the Thomas name would forever be etched into the history of Biloxi.